Your life.
Oh, hello, everybody. Welcome in. Welcome back to the Clinical Workshop series. My name is Dr. Jody Carrington, and you have found yourself in a little workshop about trauma and post traumatic stress disorder tonight. Once a month, I love to sink into a clinical topic, and tonight is no exception. I am a huge advocate for talking about trauma more these days than ever, because I think it is such a misunderstood term. And I think it is experienced by a lot of people. So, what we're going to do tonight, it's going to seem short. I'm going to tell you that already. We've got some incredible questions that I probably won't get to all of them. And I've packed as much as I can into this hour. So, we're going to buckle up and just jump right in. A couple of things I want to be clear about is that this isn't therapy. This is a workshop, a series intended to provide some information and resources. Along with your entrance into tonight, you get a resource list of things. Um, the books that I like, quotes that I think you might find helpful if you're looking for a therapist, some of the things I want you to consider. And so I put all of that in the link. And I also want to tell you another thing that I might swear. So if you have little people around you, sometimes when I get talking about things that I'm really passionate about, I'm not ever so sure. Sometimes the filter just goes away too. So prepare your hearts. And the last thing that is always important for me to acknowledge is that everything that I am going to give to you tonight was created here on Treaty 7 land, which is now known as the center part of the province of Alberta. It's home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. Tonight, what we're going to talk a lot about comes back to acknowledgement, because the interesting thing about trauma is that I have a few slides that I'm going to show you tonight, but for starters, I just want to talk about trauma as an entity, okay? And there are a lot of people in this space that are brilliant researchers. I'm going to name a few of them tonight, like Stephen Porges and Bessel van der Kolk and Bruce Perry, some phenomenal women who have done these great big research studies, Vince Felitti and colleagues, that I'm going to refer to all night. And there's some reference points that I've included in all of in the resource list. But here's what I think about Gabor Mate as well. You'll hear his name a lot tonight. But trauma is like this invisible force that shapes our lives. It shapes the way we live, the way we love, and the way we make sense of the world. It is the root of our deepest wounds. And in fact, so Gabor often talks about this. Trauma comes from a Greek word that means wound. And when someone touches a wound, okay, so if you have a physical wound, I want us to think a lot about tonight, like, see, trauma for me is an emotional injury. It's an emotional wound, and it is almost, in fact, exactly the same as a physical wound. Okay, so if you think about trauma as a wound, when someone touches a wound or opens a sore that you have, it's often painful. If you avoid it, don't bother it, it can just stay there. It might fester, but unless it's properly attended to, time alone cannot heal all wounds. Okay, we often think about that in this world of, I had an awful experience, but that was such a long time ago. People tell me this all the time. Now, one of the other things that I really want to point out tonight, and so many people have just said so beautifully in the days leading up to this event tonight, is that, like, oftentimes when we think about trauma, we think about particularly PTSD, we think about wartime. We think about, this is where it became most popular, right? Is trying to understand when we sent soldiers overseas or people in military organizations, they would come back and never be the same. And so this was really the impetus of studying, what happens to the body, the brain, when we put it on high alert or expose it to really contentious, traumatic, intense experiences, and then don't provide a place for it to come down. So I when we're talking about PTSD tonight, I want to be very clear. I'm a massive advocate for first responders. And this isn't just about first responders tonight. This is about, we're going to talk about the 10 things that often are considered traumatic for kids. We're going to talk about how seeing a car accident and not being anywhere, having anywhere, a dog attack, like there's many, many things that can manifest as a traumatic experience, a wound, a psychological wound in your body. I also think that traumatized is a term that gets extremely overused in our colloquial language. I went to this movie, I got traumatized. I experienced this with this family system, I got traumatized. There's a very big difference about being scared or mortified or put on edge with somebody that will differentiate an experience of your brain, your body experiencing it as a psychological wound. Okay. So I really want to be careful about the definition tonight before we jump in, because I think that there is a lot of conversation around just what it means to be traumatized. The problem is there is no, I don't know if this is a problem, but like there's no measurement. I cannot take your blood and say, yep, you're traumatized. Nope, you're not. We do know today, because of MRI and CT studies, that neurological differences happen. Your body actually does physically change when it experiences a trauma, particularly chronic exposure to trauma. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the difference. There's a lot of buzz around PTSD and CPTSD, which is complex PTSD. CPTSD, complex PTSD, is not yet recognized in the DSM, but it is, just as it sounds, more complex, often related to those who experience chronic trauma, like where you cannot do anything about it. You feel completely helpless. For example, a child who is involved in exploitation or sexual abuse for many, many years, right? Oftentimes, when we get into this place of hopelessness, the complexity of PTSD seems to be that much deeper. Okay. So when we talk about is this a thing we should be talking about? Some of the data around this is, about 70% of adults in North America have experienced a traumatic event at least once, but not everyone who experiences trauma will develop PTSD. Okay, because here's the interesting thing. Most of us at some point, in fact, the vast majority, I think that number is low, will experience something encoded in terror. And so it is estimated that about 20% of people who experience a traumatic incident in some capacity will then go on to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. What I find really interesting is that women, it is thought, are twice as likely to develop PTSD than men. I think there is a lot of confounding factors in the data when we report some statistics like that, because I think women are much better able at identifying symptoms or talking about symptoms. And so it's then much easier to measure. But that's the data that we got. And just a note about the risk of developing PTSD varies based on the trauma. So the risk is especially high after rape, physical assault, and other sexual assaults. And so the complete and utter violation of our bodies when we are completely out of control tends to be, as you can well imagine, a little bit more difficult to integrate, and sometimes more difficult to talk about, sometimes more difficult to even share a story. And when we don't have a place to put it, right, that's where the problem tends to manifest. Okay. So what I want to just be clear about is that, the most important influence on the biological development of the human brain is the quality of adult-child relationships, period, is in when we are little, developing, that developmental process. But the early years of neurological development becomes really important. Later on, the relationship that we have in order to put any experience anywhere is really predictive of our ability to handle hard things. Okay. So I love this place. I just want to sort of preface this talk a little bit by some of van der Kolk's work. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and I've linked that resource here for you. He says this, which I think is profound. Okay. The urgent work of the brain after a traumatic event is to suppress it. Therefore, forgetting or self-blame, to avoid being ostracized. It just is like, we don't want the body to stay in there. So sometimes we black it out. Sometimes it becomes something that, the body does very much in a protective way, trying to make you forget. Here's the interesting thing: cognitively, we forget, but the body does not forget. The physiological changes result in sort of a recalibration of the brain's alarm system, an increase in stress hormones, and alteration in a system that filters relevant information from irrelevant information. You can cognitively be like, I was so young when that happened. It was only one time. This is what we're supposed to do as a police officer. I didn't, all of those examples can come into place. But the truth about all of this is the body keeps the score. So let me slow down a little bit. I want to just show you a couple of slides real quick. Let me see if I can share this. All right, so let's take a look here. When we're defining trauma, I want to be clear for the purposes of tonight that trauma is a psychological injury. And so much like a physical injury, it needs to be treated effectively and with most effective intervention, efficiently, and with the most effective interventions to heal. Okay. If I take that even a bit of a step further, when I'm thinking about trauma in terms of sort of how we define it specifically, it is any experience encoded in terror. Okay. And so it becomes really difficult then to be able to identify who's going to be traumatized and who isn't, because let's take a look at the brain, for example. So I want you to take a look at this. Your nose, as you can see where it is on this diagram, your prefrontal cortex is the thing I'm most worried about. The cerebral cortex, as it's talked about on here. Where the processing of big emotion tends to happen is inside the brain, in the internal parts of theirs. So the midbrain, when we're talking about the limbic system, it's very deep in the brain. So when I talk about experiencing something in terror, when we are managing our everyday lives and we are calm, our body is in a calm physical state, our prefrontal cortex is on. Okay, so then that image that I just showed you of the brain, we can do this on our hand just for easy stuff. The primitive part of our brain is the inside, the limbic system. What separates humans from most other mammals is we have this prefrontal cortex that wraps around the limbic system. Okay, when that is on, we can process things, we can slow things down, we can use everything that we've ever known to be true. When, for example, we get into a incident where we don't feel safe, like somebody's going to attack us or a bear jumps out of the bushes, your body naturally does this. It flips the prefrontal cortex out of the way because it knows in order to keep you safe, it only has to fight, flight, and freeze. That's what it just does. That you actually don't even have to think about that. That's an automatic response. Okay. And so when I'm talking about encoding something in terror, typically when something is considered traumatic, you've encoded it in terror. There is a necessary thing that there is actually in that moment a threat that has then allowed you to encode that. Not very specific about the details, but you've just flipped your lid and out comes the bear. If I go to, for example, I've experienced physical abuse, right? I know that I'm not going to be safe in this moment. I hear, for example, uncle coming through the door and there's boom, boom, boom. I know he's been drinking. I'm going to flip my lid because I know I have to be ready to fight or to run, sometimes to freeze, right? If the physical abuse ensues, or I observe him yelling, screaming, doing something like that in that way, I am not in a place to encode the specifics of that situation because my brain is protecting me. Okay. The body does that to be able to make sure that you can function in a way that just keeps you safe. If I think about a first responder going to an incident, you don't need access to your childhood phone number or the middle name of your children in that moment. I want you to flip so much out of that way and be very rote in your capacity for doing things. Our body does a very, very good job of getting the prefrontal cortex out of the way during a trauma. Part of the biggest issue when we talk about PTSD is how we incorporate then that experience and put that lid back on. When you think about the chronic nature of trauma, see PTSD, or somebody who's experienced, repeated exposures to things that flip their lid, you can imagine that it becomes quite difficult then to integrate some of those experiences, right? So when I think about, especially if there's no safe place to do that. Okay, if you've been surrounded by multiple generations of abuse, neglect, and trauma, if you are an adult who works in an organization where there's no time because there's bombing after bombing after bombing, and you just have to keep going and keep going and keep going, and everybody else is a disaster too, and there's no place to put it. If the culture in which you work does not support the fact that we need to talk about how scary that was on the ice tonight, if the culture is such that boys don't cry, suck it up, you're fine, over time it becomes very difficult to integrate those stories. Okay, now what's interesting to me is that they don't even necessarily have to be done on purpose. When we are surrounded by the safety of an environment, if I can go to school, if I have a caring adult, if I have a safe place to land, even if I don't need to process it physically, if I can get back to safety in my body, oftentimes that allows some processing to occur. Okay, because you can imagine, a lot of work that Stephen Porges does is talking about, what happens to animals. How do people, or to how do animals and mammals who, are exposed to lots of traumatic experiences, they would flip their lid in terror. How come they're not all walking around with PTSD? There's a very interesting response that happens when animals sort of shake it off after they vibrate after an incident. They will eat, drink, the necessities to sort of get the lid back on. There's been a lot of animal research around how the brain processes trauma. And what I think happens, of course, is it becomes very debilitating when our lids get stuck up like this. And, I often tell the story for sure in Hello Hero. And if I've ever spoke on a stage about this, I want you to, I think about this so much like a physical injury, because when there's no place to put it, it's like it manifests itself. So I often tell the story about like a rugby player when they go to a game, and they're tough, they're prepared. They're not seeing any of this coming, and everything's good. We're good. You're good. Everything's fine. They're the superstar player. They get their shit together all the time. They're the leader. Everything's fine. The culture is we're rough and tumble and we can handle everything. So we get out, don't mess with me, right? Or there's no expectation that, you're impermeable. Nobody can, you're indestructible. Okay. Or for example, there's no thought that dad would hurt you or somebody would hurt you. Okay. So just stick with the rugby analogy for whatever. I'm not prepared for the injury that's fixing to happen because I'm so fit or so ready for things. In one particular game, let's just say that you're in a scrum, somebody, rips your ear off and, steps on your knee in a way that your patella flips around to the back of your leg. It was fucking bad. Okay. Now, if there's nowhere to put it, you're mortified, you're scared, holy shit, this is really bad. And everybody's like, are you okay? Are you okay? And you're like, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. You grab your patella, you shoot it back around, you put it back on your knee, and you're like, I'm good. I'm good. Everybody's like, are you sure? Yeah, fine. You're marching. Good. Either because you cannot believe that this just happened to you, that somebody has breached your trust in this way, or that the culture isn't safe. You don't want people to know that you can't handle it. You might have people telling you, don't tell anybody. You can understand, I hope, this is kind of many analogies mixed into one here, but how sometimes it is so easy to, not easy, my goodness, how you can understand how the beginning of not being able to process trauma happens for so many of us, right? Because generally speaking, we want everybody that we love and we lead to be okay. You're good. You're good. It's okay. We're fine. It's okay. I generally, when I see parents in my office who know that their kids have experienced something really difficult, they just want them to be okay. I hear people say this to me all the time. They're really resilient. They got through it. They're doing good. They're doing good. They're really good. Mostly, and that might be true, but generally speaking, we really want them to be okay. And we sometimes miss this place of really checking in. Can you handle that? And the body keeps the score. And so sometimes we want ourselves to be okay too. We're good. It didn't affect me. We're totally good. It's fine. It's part of the job. It's what I do. It's totally good. Okay. You can imagine then if I leave that rugby field, having just had my ear ripped off, which is really the least of our worries right now because the patella is fucking misplaced. We slam that bitch back on, get in the car. Everybody's like, are you good? You're good. You're good. You get in the car. You're like, I'm not good. Holy shit. So then you get home and it hurts very, very badly. Okay. So you do everything. You come into work the next day and everybody's like, are you good? You're like, mm-hmm. And now you're not sleeping. And now you're taking pain medication. And now 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, days, months go by and you're irritable. And you can't stop thinking about that sound and how this is really, they're benching you now all the time. And you don't know why. And so you're mad and you're not sleeping. So then you take a little more pills or booze or whatever to knock yourself out and sleep. And before you know it, you're a disaster. And what happens often in, situations like this, if we now switch to understanding it as a psychological wound, what happens is people will often come to me or a therapist or, sort of decide to put some of this somewhere and they don't want to revisit it, right? They just want it to be fixed. And so for many years, I think therapeutic interventions have looked like trying to get rid of the symptoms. Okay. So let's deep breathe through it. Let's journal. Let's do all the things. I will tell you to the core of me that what has to happen when there is trauma that we can identify, there needs to be a reprocessing that happens not just on a cognitive level, but on a somatic level. Okay, which means integrating this number one question: where do you feel it? Okay, and I think what further perpetuates the problem is that oftentimes kids don't have a memory of that necessarily, but they will have a feeling. It becomes very difficult for people who have been engaged in being tough and do not have language to describe feelings, to be able to even put them in that position. When I speak to, somebody who, a middle-aged kid who, caused an accident and there was a death at the scene. I've worked with a number, if I think about, patients long ago, and I'll just give you a hypothetical situation, being able to even revisit that because of the guilt and the shame and talk about what that felt like, where you felt it in your body. When I say, where do you feel it as you sit in this chair right now? There's often lots of questions about, what do you mean, where do I feel it? I can tell you, this is what happened, this is what happened, this is what happened. And I can say, okay, I got it. I got it. Now let's slow it down a little bit and get it back to your body. Where do you feel it? I don't understand that question. Where do I feel it? Oftentimes we hold it here, shoulders. I want to pay attention a little bit to the manifestation of that in the body because what happens in getting stuck in the processing of some of those emotions means how do we sort of get back to just feeling it, honoring it, giving it some space, and not trying to stuff it and avoid it because what as Van der Kolk talks about, the brain just really wants to forget it and it wants to be okay. Our job is to give it a little bit of space and light and remind the body that it is no longer in that state of panic. It is no longer in that fearful place because what tends to happen, you understand, like this, is that if you experience a lot of trauma or if you experience many experiences encoded in terror or one big one, generally there's a lot that gets put together in there. Your lid tends to stay a bit on edge all the time. And some of the symptoms, as you can experience or guess, would be hypervigilance, not believing that the world is a safe place because the story that your body has experienced is that big people aren't safe, or that bad guys aren't safe, or that dads and moms can't be trusted, or that teachers are whatever that is. And so the interesting thing to me about the healing of trauma is that the very thing, the very entity typically that caused that trauma, another human being, is the exact same entity that is going to be required to heal it. Somebody being able to create a safe enough space to convince the body that it is not always at war, at risk, in danger. Okay. So what I think is so interesting about this process is some of the impacts of trauma. Gabor talks about this a little bit, but there is a necessary separation of the self that happens when I'm going to put myself in a place where I separate from my body. You might have read in abuse cases, for example, that people dissociate during an abuse or a rape, which means they just get out of their body because it is safer not to feel it at all, right? So getting lost in the wallpaper or a sound or singing a song in your head or, being able to just do the job is a very, very protective way that the body takes over in those moments to navigate, to keep you safe psychologically. The issue is the body keeps the score. Now, there's also a disconnection from other people, as you can imagine. You don't trust that the world is a safe place. So you can imagine the thing then to be able to retell the story to the body we want to isolate and stay away from, which makes most things, isolating and alone. It becomes very difficult to sort of engage in that process to do the healing. And subsequently the world view sometimes shifts. It is now a dangerous and scary place based on what the people in your world or their world have taught them to be true. And I think what's also really true is that it's a wound. And with all wounds, there's pain. We don't like pain, so we tend to want to escape from the pain, especially when we haven't addressed it. And the other thing that we talked a little bit about tonight is that it affects brain development, most notably if some of the greatest impacts happened in childhood. If adults are unable to regulate their kid's brain, it can be easily transmitted intergenerationally. So there's often also, that we don't talk about a lot of shame that happens when you're unable to deal with the shit that you've experienced. There is often feelings of incompetency that go along with not being able to control your body's response to something. And there is, of course, as you know, the stigma in the world of mental health further perpetuates this idea. You're not tough enough to handle it. Oh, you are too weak, or you toughen up, get stronger. And so it then becomes very difficult again to be present with anybody. So when people experience, I want to show you these a couple of slides again. Okay, so if I were to take you back to, son of a bitch, hang on. Here. Okay, share that guy. All right. So if I were to take you back to this brain experience, okay. So oftentimes when people are talking about what is most notably understandable is that people who do first responder work often encode many things in terror, because very rarely do those working in the ER or paramedics or firefighters, even police officers, get to go to places where things are safe. Okay. You rarely get a call, as an EMT or a paramedic when it's like, oh yeah, shit's going well. Just stop by. We just had a little, there's no accident here. Everybody's doing well. Generally speaking, if you're calling 911, shit's good. There's a lot of people that are flipping their lids. And you think about, what I think a lot about is 911 operators, right? Every time that phone rings, you can imagine it is always paired with somebody, 90% of the time, who is in a state of terror. So you can imagine, right, that the phone then becomes something that is very much a scary thing. A phone in and of itself isn't scary, but it gets very attached to those things. The triggers then happen in ways where we don't even know. Why should a phone be scary? Why does the smell of gasoline bother us? Why does all those things? The body keeps the score. And so we get in that state anticipating. The body is already waiting to protect you because of what might happen. And I will tell you this, when I take it to kids, for example, some of the data, so if we step out of the first responder world, for example, there's 10 things that Vince Felitti and colleagues did some research around that said, listen, without intervention, here is the top 10 things that kids will, if they experience 0 to 18, they will encode this experience in terror. Okay. Now, of course, this isn't everyone, but this is a vast study that is very highly responded to in the data. And so here's the top 10 things. And basically what happened is these are some of the most trauma-inducing experiences for kids 0 to 18. The experience of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. the experience of physical or emotional neglect. Two very, very different things. So this is the ACEs research, adverse childhood experiences stuff. You can Google this. There's lots of, this isn't proprietary information in any way. This is probably the most referenced study when we start to talk about kids and experiences. And it all is also often used for people to reflect in their adulthood about what they experienced in childhood that may have later, messed them up, especially if it hasn't been attended to. Did you live with somebody who experienced a mental illness? Did you observe your mother being treated violently? Were you a product of divorce? Did you live with somebody who later went to jail? And did you live with somebody who experienced substance abuse? What happens in any of these experiences, these 10 things, is that there is an encoding of terror that tends to happen when your world starts to fall apart. When the big people in your world are emotionally dysregulated or are hurting you. And you can imagine then that the brain does this, flips the lid in an effort to protect. And the idea oftentimes is when the system is not doing well, it becomes very difficult for the child to make sense of hard things. Okay. And so what I think is really critical in terms of research, in addition to this, so when I wrote Kids These Days, I just wrote a lot about Felidi's work. And then I started thinking, okay, so like, but then what? Like if you have a really high ACEs score, many of those things have happened to you 0 to 18, or the kids that you love or you lead or you teach, then what? Like, are we screwed? And the response is no. Am I a huge believer that the response to traumatic incidents always, always, in all ways can be healed and modified? And listen, here's the truth of this. We are never the same today as we will be tomorrow. And any experience that significantly changes the trajectory of our life or experiences of our days, we will never be the same after those things. We will never be the same. Today, if I get a toothache or an experience with my kid or like whatever the deal is, okay, that the intention is never to go back to normal, because you can't, for all intents and purposes, erase the memory. The idea mostly is how we integrate the experiences that we have every single day. And when we look at some of the benevolent research, and so that's sort of some of my favorite places to land these days, is yes, I need to understand the stories of people, being able to sort of get a sense of what happened in those experiences. But here is some of the corrected data, particularly around kids. Narian and colleagues came up with 10 things that also, they said, listen, if a kid experiences these things, they equivocally help to defend against or assist in mitigating the effects of trauma. Things like, did you have good neighbors? Did you have at least one adult that cared about you? Did you have routines and meals, bedtime routines? Did you like school? And so oftentimes these days, I spend a lot of time speaking to educators and hockey coaches and people who are facilitating that in our communities, where when we see incidents of domestic violence and child maltreatment, never this high, the importance of our respective roles in our community, caring for, assisting with, stopping by the nurse's station, coaching minor hockey, and understanding that when kids are having bad days or they're late, there's likely a story there. And our ability to sink into, noticing, looking, and seeing each other is one of the most, I think, important things that I talk to many organizations about, whether it's child and family services or, policing organizations or any first responder places where we're training people to assist those of us who will inevitably, all of us will inevitably be in a state of emotional dysregulation and require people to walk us through it. If we don't look after those walkers, the people they serve don't stand a chance. And we have historically been horrific at looking after the people doing the walking. This is true of teachers and nurses and physicians and child and family services advocates, child and family services workers, social workers. Like, if I had all the money in the world, I would be investing in the helpers, because we will never in our lifetime or the multiple lifetimes that come after this one, will we mitigate mental health? Will we mitigate multiple generations of abuse, neglect, and trauma? How we respond to it becomes the most significant part of interventions these days, I think. So, what I will also say is that when we think about post traumatic stress disorder, okay, so that's just my take on trauma. PTSD develops when the experiences that were encoded in terror didn't have anywhere to go. And so PTSD has been associated with a wide range of traumatic experiences, and the risk of developing PTSD after a traumatic event varies by trauma type, the research would tell us. And it is the highest following exposure to sexual violence, particularly rape. Uh, as we said at the outset, men are more likely to experience a traumatic event of any type, but women tend to be more likely to experience the kind of high impact traumatic event that can lead to PTSD, such as interpersonal violence or sexual assault. Okay. Now, when we talk about symptoms, I have a little graphic that I want to show you that I think might be helpful. Hang on here. Let me see if I can try this again. Let's take a look here. This is just something that I'm going to just expand on a little bit. But when we think about some PTSD symptoms, I want you to consider some of these things. So, repetitive, there's intrusive thoughts, a tendency to avoid some things, a heightened state of arousal, which is making it obviously very difficult to rest and regulate the body. Changes in thoughts and feelings. So lots of interest. The activities tend to go that you used to find fun. It's the idea of just sort of trying to keep that body regulated. So there's unwanted memories. Sometimes we see some things like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. The body tends to be in this very complex state. And I think that I want to be clear, despite the fact that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is found in the DSM-5, and it's been in multiple editions of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. All of us, psychiatrists, physicians, and psychologists, clinical social workers, use this as the diagnostic Bible. So when I'm looking to identify whether somebody meets criteria for a clinical disorder, I am looking in the DSM. And it's sort of like the golden standard of practice. What confuses so many people is that in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, PTSD appears there. And so for a very long time, we have ostracized people in thinking that, you have a mental illness as a result of PTSD. That is not true. It is a psychological injury. And so thankfully, in the most recent iteration of the DSM, there's a different conversation around the criteria that is responsible for experiencing PTSD-like symptoms. And what I would say, so much about this is a thing that I tend to talk about a lot. Emotions will not kill you. Not talking about them might, because this is a quote by Bessel that I just really love. Being able to feel safe with another person, with other people, is probably the single most important aspect of mental health. Safe connections are fundamental to meaningful and satisfying lives. And what happens in this place of trauma is that many people stop feeling safe. Many experiences, the world stops feeling safe. And so if we were to just sort of, take it back to some of the symptoms again, reliving the event. So you can imagine if we're encoding it like this, and there hasn't been a place to sort of put it back and make sense of it, like, this was one experience, or this was a night, or this wasn't my fault, that little girl didn't invite this, or this in that moment, those decisions were made, I was there to assist in this process. If all of those things, if you come back and you're good, it's fine. Vivid flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, physical sensations. I will have people describe panic attacks, or I've often talked about this, little things that people don't make sense of or can't make sense of when they see Christmas lights, or smell gingerbread cookies, or paint, or bleach, or you can imagine just sort of the stories that might be associated with all of those things for certain people. And I think more often than not, there's certain common things that tend to trigger people, music, a certain kind of music, or, whatever the deal is. And oftentimes when we don't unpack our stories, we become very unaware of why our bodies go into this state. We're driving down the highway. I heard a police officer tell me this once. And, he's enjoying the day with his family. And they're driving, from down a highway. And he suddenly has trouble breathing, right? He's we put it together later when we really understood that there was in that particular day there was a 4-H highway cleanup. There was lots of bags in the ditch, and one of the most difficult calls that he ever had to go to was to see the discarded body of a human that was found in the ditch. And there was not a lot of work done around what that was like and what that event reminded them of and what they then had to do as a result of finding that human and sharing that experience with that human's family. That the sight of a bag in a ditch was enough. Now he knew he's in a safe place. He's not even on duty in that moment, right? There is a connection to that experience where the body does this, and I'm chippy and I'm irritable and I just want to get the fuck out of this car right now, right? And people are like, what's wrong with you, Dad? I don't know, but this is stupid. We shouldn't be here. And even sometimes when we do become aware of those things, the body's a pretty powerful responder. And what we do with that, just even the acknowledgement of that, tends to be the first step. Okay. Now, you can also imagine that alertness or feeling on edge is often another common symptom in the checklist of PTSD. Irritable, jumpy, hypervigilance. If your body tends to expect danger all the time, and it's understandably should expect danger, given the context of those stories, then loud noises, unexpected changes in routine, or even the flicking on and off of a light can be extremely scary to the body. And so there's often, or there can be much more jumpiness. Avoiding feelings or memories. So numbing, unable to express emotions, keeping busy. I've never cried. I'm just fucking not going there. I don't want to talk about it because the body feels so yucky when we go there. And part of the deal, if you will, is to sort of not push through the yuck, create a safe place in the body while addressing some of that yuck tends to be how some of the most effective interventions work these days. Now, I think some things that I want you to consider as we sort of get to come to the end. I know there's a lot of questions, and so I really want to make sure that we have lots of time for that. Some things to consider. So trauma can't always be conquered or fixed or resolved, but it can be heard and held, and pieces can be put back together. That's the good news. It's not the experience like the sexual abuse, the witnessing death or war or abandonment. It's how you made sense of it at the time. For example, the common making sense of includes things like this. It was my fault. I should have done more. I invited it. I did nothing to stop it. And it is that story that often needs some light. So the best part, I would say, that's the best part, because you can't change your experiences, but you can certainly change your perception or your understanding of them. And I think that is where I get the most hope in this place of trauma. And, I often say this on stages, I love to talk about it because it is so misunderstood. You cannot change your experiences, and that's okay. That is not the thing that should be the concerning thing to you. How you respond to them is 100% manageable, workable, pliable, and that's where the healing lives. Okay, so I'll mention another name for you, Peter Levine, who I really adore. His work is kind of astounding because he said, I realized that trauma was about being stuck in these high levels of arousal or in low level shutdown or dissociation. So we're either stuck low, flat, dissociated, or high alert. Okay, the body either takes you to those two things. So it really, as Levine talks about, it really became a matter of learning how to help people contain those sensations and help them move through back into life. to discharge, as it were, he says, these high levels or low levels of activation. Okay. And I love that sort of getting back to, I don't even want to say reality, but what is there some safety that we can create a sense of by exploring what got us to the places where it doesn't feel safe? Okay. So just a couple of points that I think I put in your notes around navigating post-trauma incidents and then PTSD. Judith Herman's work is perhaps the most clear on the three stages of trauma recovery. She talks a lot about safety and stabilization, remembrance and mourning, and then reconnection and integration. We often want to jump before we get into that place of safety and stabilization. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about EMDR in a minute. But safety and stabilization becomes one of the most important pieces of an intervention. And so if I think about that, number one piece is really then drawing attention, connection to the head and the heart. And some of the most profound work, I think, comes in really recognizing that oftentimes your body does this. I have a patient who I've seen for many, many years. It's always like this. And I can see, when we're talking about something where it feels safe, or when we start speaking about their father, when we start speaking about their feelings of incompetency as a 13-year-old kid, this happens unbeknownst often to this human. When I say, okay, I can see the jaw. Let's get back down as we talk, creating that sense of safety and stabilization becomes really important. So when we think about that, even post a difficult incident, after, you went to a call, or, your babe has been really in a difficult situation, being able to slow the body down, getting a snack, getting eye contact, really being able, Levine often talks about, witnessing this in animals, the shaking. I often do this in between sessions, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but getting my body back and regulated. If I've had a couple of really intense sessions in therapy, not doing my own therapy, which also I have to do this with, but if I'm going to see 3 or 4 or 5 patients in a day, you will see us in this office sometimes closing the kitchen door and jumping, right? Shaking it off physically, like this, getting that system out. I mean, it's often what getting that out of your system. I mean, and animals, do this, and observing animals in the wild, this is what happens. It's that shaking out. And now people feel like that's weird. There's massive amounts of data to support. So I would love to implement this in police departments and fire services across the land. Can you imagine you come into like some fire station or a police department and there's been a really hard shift, or like you're a child and family services advocate and you come into the shift after and people are like that. I really think that'd be helpful. So full permission, all of you. Teachers, jump at the end of the day, shake it. See, do you know what? Do you know what the problem is? Not the problem. Taylor Swift fucking gets it all. Shake it off. Didn't she say that? I don't know. I can't remember. But anyway. 2, noticing the sensation in the bodies and befriending them, ground in them. And I think, this idea often of people being very scared of the flashbacks and the hypervigilance, and that oftentimes it becomes a bit weird to be able to say, okay, it's okay. It's okay. I can handle this. This is an emotion. I'm not in this incident. Those abilities to sort of externally regulate your body tend to be very helpful. And I wrote in these notes, which, this is a bit of a direction, which might not always be true, but be okay with the fact that it might feel big as your body's trying to understand if it really is in fact in danger. And we often avoid and step off when we're not present, when that body feels like it's really big and in danger. But being able to analyze or have somebody with you to sort of remind you that in this moment you are safe. can become some of the most important interventions, or the most important sort of places, I think, to be able to navigate. And I've mentioned this just briefly, but a few things that help in the grounding, getting back to the present when you can, is things like physically moving your body, taking a drink, eating something. And I'm not, oftentimes people say to me, this isn't, facilitating an eating disorder. No, 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 no. What I'm talking about is, how do you physically ground yourself when you feel yourself floating away or disconnecting, or, you know, when you ground back, wiggle your toes, drop your shoulders, relax your jaw. All of those things are really, really critical. And having that sense that in this moment, if this is true, I am safe, is sometimes so critically important. The other piece of the note that I put in there for you is therapeutic approaches, therapeutic approaches and seeking a therapist. Apparently, I got that word wrong, but so I just put a little note in there about some of the things that I think might be helpful for you to look for, if you are considering engaging in therapy, engaging with a professional who understands the importance of creating a safe space. Again, as Herman talked about, safety and stabilization, then sort of processing whatever that looks like, mourning the experience, giving it some space, acknowledging it, whatever that looks like, and then reconnection and integration in those three places. What I think does a really good job of that. Is most emotion focused or somatic approaches to therapy. So one of my favorites would be to consider someone trained in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is known as EMDR. EMDR is originally developed by a woman named Francine Shapiro in 1987. And there's been several iterations, evolutions that have been made since its inception. And it often involves the processing of the feelings within the body that were experienced during or around a difficult or traumatic experience, not necessarily the experience itself. Okay. What was happening in the body? So efficacy with somatic treatments, like including EMDR approaches, have, in my experience, garnered much more positive results than strict cognitive and or behavioral approaches. So I think further, there have been so much research of EMDR therapy that is now recognized. It is now recognized as an effective form of treatment for trauma and other disturbing experiences by organizations such as the American Psychiatric Association, the World Health Organization, Department of Defense. I think at the beginning of my clinical career, there was very little data on these somatic processing sort of experiences that take you out of your head and into your body. I was so skeptical early in my career as well. Oftentimes the beginning of Shapiro's work was about, moving eyes back and forth, which oftentimes now that it doesn't even need to involve that. It's about the stimulation of your brain in a safe space that sometimes can happen. And when I say stimulation of your brain, that's even really hard. Not what I'm talking about necessarily, but being able to get you in a calm state is, I think, the most powerful piece of working through some of that stuff that that your body has experienced. Also, in your resources, I put some books that I love that you can, look up and take a further look into if you want. Again, I've talked often around here about Bruce Perry's work. The What Happened to You book is a really good read. Judith Herman is rewritten again, Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. I'm a huge fan of when, particularly in sexual assault or incest cases where it feels as though there's no justice. How do you recover if there's no ability to get to your abuser, or the family system is no longer accessible, whatever those look like? What is that? And she's just got some brilliant insight there. Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma. That's Peter Levine's work is so often referenced in this world. The Body Keeps the Score too. I don't know if I ended up in that with Bessel van der Kolk, but that's also a good one. I also left you with a few quotes that I really want to draw some attention to. Gabor's work around trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And so you can imagine, for example, that you and I, your stories about things really depict how you will encode things. I'll give you a quick example about this. Let's say I hate dogs and you love dogs. Okay. I hate dogs because I was bitten once when I was 2. My babysitter made me watch Cujo when I was 6. And I have a fear of dogs. I don't like them. I don't, whatever. You, on the other hand, my friend, are a dog whisperer. You're a trainer. You have a kennel. You love all kinds of dogs. You have 6 of them. You have a breeding facility. You're a lover of dogs. They don't scare you, right? We can take any animal, horses, but like, it doesn't matter to me, okay? And so we're out frolicking in the woods and our lids are on, okay? And I know our lids are on and we're regulated because we're laughing and we're talking and all those things. And out of the bushes jumps a Rottweiler. Okay. Now, what's going to happen to my lid? I am fucking terrified of dogs. What's going to happen to my lid? Boom. How does the dog respond to me? It eats me. Okay. So a self-fulfilling prophecy has occurred because there's no fucking chance this dog is going to, I've flipped its lid, it's flipped mine. Now, you, on the other hand, if you see the dog first, you see a person's best, oh, little Roddy, and you're down on your hands and knees and you're loving on this dog. And how does the dog respond to you? So, based on your experiences, right, you have had many companions that are dogs, you understand dogs, you work with them well, you get it. This is the exact same experience. Same sights, same smells, same time of day, same dog. And we experienced it entirely different, which is why when I talk to organizations about, predicting PTSD or why do certain people experience it better than others, you can't fucking predict that stuff because all of us have experiences that predispose us to certain conditions. And we may be more hypervigilant if we grew up in a place where there was lots of violence in our home. Loud voices and yelling in relationships might be very difficult for us to set into. If we grew up in a place, for example, where alcohol was never a problem and yelling is just how you get through to somebody and it was always felt relatively safe in that way, then that's not a problem. You understand? So understanding our respective stories is really predictive of how we engage in our experiences in life. And at the beginning of tonight, we talked a lot about this idea that trauma is this invisible force that shapes your lives. It shapes the way you live and the way you love and the way you make sense of the world. Because when it is a wound, it affects the way that we perceive things. And an understanding and a knowledge of some of those things, just a bringing into awareness of, can really assist in this process. And again, as Bessel, has said, I'll tell you this other quote. It's about becoming safe to feel what you feel. When you're traumatized, you're afraid of what you're feeling because your feeling is always terror or fear or helplessness. He says he thinks that body-based techniques help you to feel what's happening in your body and to breathe into it and not run away from it. So you learn to befriend your experience. It doesn't mean you condone, support, believe any of the experiences that you may have had, but it is about a relationship with what happened in your body, not what happened to you. That becomes the most critical piece. Okay. And the last quote that I think I wanted to share with you was one from Peter Levine, who I love this because it is the impetus to every piece of work that I do in this space. He says, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathic witness. So if you are in this place where you love somebody, you are in organizations where you work with somebody, where you understand, oftentimes what becomes critical is if we can't hold space for our loved ones, it's about building a village of people who can. It's about understanding the processes of a wound and engaging in, I think, the creation of a network that becomes safe enough to be able to walk people through the hard stuff. Okay, so I'm just looking at the questions. Um, okay, good. That I want to respond to now because that was an hour, friends. Um, Marty, if you or Des, if you want to tell me anything that I'm missing, I have my text open if there's some of the questions that I might need to know about. But I'm going to dive into some of the ones that you so beautifully sent me, and we're going to get to as many as we can about them. And then I'm just going to also talk about some other resources that I'll make sure I'll leave for you too. Where are we? Here we go. Okay. So some of the questions that we got were many and beautiful, and let's just start with a couple of these. And some of these I really hope that I was able to answer in some of our time together tonight. Um, hang tight here. Let's get her. Okay, thanks, Marty, for sending that. I would love to know more about the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. Also, how PTSD or a psychological injury and how it may differ, if any, specifically to individuals under the first responders or operations role. Okay, so I'm not sure. So complex PTSD is really, as we understand it in the research, I think is really much more about CP complex PTSD. Is not recognized as a formal diagnosis yet. It doesn't. I think what is so clearly important to know is that um, there is such a difference in the complexity of when there is an inability to do anything about the trauma happening to you or at the hands of the people who are putting that trauma to you, how long the exposure is. I think you can imagine that the longer the brain stays in a state of terror, the more it becomes into this sort of complex place. I think that what matters the most, I think, is that when we think a little bit more about the chronic, the complex PTSD, it's like sort of a psychological stress injury that results from ongoing or repeated trauma. And it's thought that, over which like sort of the victim has no control or little control. There is no real or perceived hope of escape. So it's sometimes much more associated with things like chronic sexual, psychological, or physical abuse or neglect, or chronic intimate partner violence, so domestic violence, victims of kidnapping, hostage situations, victims of slavery, human trafficking, prisoners of war, residential school survivors. Um, Clearly, it can be associated with events of childhood where kids have no control over these adverse experiences. And I think that, again, Herman talks a little bit about this. Her work led to the inclusion of complex PTSD in the ICD-11, which is another diagnostic place to land that is often not as referenced as the DSM, because the American Psychiatric Association sort of gives its blessing to the DSM. So I think there's a little bit of a difference there, and which is important, I think, just in terms of what that looks like. But I think what is really critical in response to your question is, I think that we will encode things in terror when we work in organizations where we go to people's most distressed moments. That isn't an if, it's a when. And I think the response is, let's not try to avoid it. Let's have a plan for when those things happen. What are we doing for our people? How are we acknowledging this in training, in the current set of people who are serving? And what do we do when we have had people who have served in this place for a very long time and are now retired? And how do we identify it? How do we recognize it? And how do we support it? Okay, so what questions can we ask to help us find a therapist we can connect with? My biggest fear is that my trauma related to my young daughter's cancer treatment will be something that is too big or too specific for someone to help me with. Okay, so I would, I gave you a couple of little examples in those resources there. I think when seeking a therapist, I need to tell you one of the questions I want you to ask is their experience with working in this place of trauma. Uh, have they done this? Have they been trained in that way? And you have every right to ask those questions. Wonder if they have been trained in things like EMDR, Haikomi, and in sort of body somatic experiences. Also, I mean, asking a question about their regulatory body. Are they a licensed professional? Those are just a few things that I think are great. And I got to tell you, more than anything, maybe not more than anything, but maybe equally as important is the fit is I want you to pay close attention to the feeling that happens. Does it feel like a safe relationship? Can you give it a shot or two to feel whether that's even a possibility? And I think that becomes probably most important. So, how do I find this other question is, how do I find a healthy way to deal with my short temper, angry outbursts at my partner? We're both police officers. I'm currently off work and I am very isolated, no friends, family, or children. I don't leave the house much. So my husband is my only sounding board, which means he is a recipient of a lot of shameful anger. Um, I thank you so much for that, my friend. Um, I think that I love your response here. I'm in this treatment program, which I think is fantastic. You are very aware. People often are. Here's what I'm doing. I'm isolated. I'm scared. All of these things have become really debilitating to me. I can now see how I got here. Oftentimes, it's about slowly, one step at a time, undoing that, finding the people that can assist you in the process of stepping out of that tightly wound web that your body has convinced you that the world represents. And I think this place of stepping out one step at a time, what is the first step? Connecting to the people who you trust. What do you need from, your best friends, your former best friends, your family system? I think it becomes very, very difficult for us to expect that one person, and not expect, but that our single partner or the one who gets it all the time will be the only one that can walk us through it. And that often happens in very isolating jobs like policing and nursing and ER physicians where like nobody gets it except for these guys. Yeah, yeah. And then generally what happens is we perpetuate the trauma. Not always, because you need people who get it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about how do we then expand this a little bit so that we get some exposure to that there is some safety in the world. And I'm just so grateful that you're here because I think that that ability to sort of start that process of putting your toes back in the water, starting to convince your body again that the world isn't what you stored in this beautiful career as a police officer because you just had nowhere to put it. How often does PTSD result in physical pain, such as chronic muscle pain? I've been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and I'm trying to make sense of it. My doctors don't seem to be able to explain it, but my intuition tells me my physical pain and trauma is related. Yes. So, in any of the work that Bessel talks about, so the body keeps a score, Gabor Mate's work around. This is the myth of normal. Okay. So, one of the things when we talk about trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture, if you don't have time to read this shit, it's brilliant. I would even, Google some of Gabor's work around his complete and utter belief that there is a massive, massive connection between um, many, many, many physical conditions. And I mean, there's lots of conversations around the increasing cancer, the higher your ACEs scores, those things that we talked about in kids, but even in adulthood, increases your risk for tons of experiences, including physical illness, diabetes, cancer, all of those things. because this machine is so connected. It is so interconnected to everything that we do in this world. So 100%, your intuition is I would say, I mean, not knowing your case, I think it's something to keep speaking to people that are involved in your treatment about, because I think it's important to connect how those two things manifest in each other. Okay, so this question is also great. My husband grew up in an authoritarian fundamentalist Christian home where he experienced both physical and emotional abuse. In the last few years, he's been experiencing nightmares where he yells out or kicks. Just wondering how I can best support him through this. Um, I love that, and sometimes the people we love the most benefit from us in a regulated state, talking about what we're observing in their behavior. Did you know this is happening? I mean, it may have nothing to do with his childhood, but it might. And so, is there a conversation that he would be willing to have, either with you or together with you, going to talk to somebody about what it was like being him and what his story is about? And sometimes it's just that invitation. The way it's done tends to happen much more when we get worried about our partners and we want to fix them. We tend to be in this place of like, oh my God, you're being such an asshole, we really need to look after this. And generally speaking, people don't respond really well to that. It's like, not if you're going to have those conversations, it's when and it's how. And when there's an alignment in that place about like, I see some changes and I miss you, and I'm not trying to fix you, I'm not trying to tell you how to do things. I want to know if there's something we're missing. And sometimes when we have went down that path multiple times and there's been no response, sometimes it's about garnering the village who might be more effective in breaking through. And I have to say this to parents, right? If it's not you walking your kid through this thing, you can see them, and they're not going to respond to you. It's often because, we don't want to hurt the people we love the most, or worry the people we love the most, or we think the people we love the most are skewed in their perceptions of us. And so oftentimes it is helpful to recruit the best friend, the teacher, the boss that they respect, the hockey coach that they once loved. And here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm worried about. Would it be okay to have a conversation with him, with her, with them? I am the wife of a retired policeman of 30 years. How do I get past the feeling of neglect and rejection when he's at his lowest? I see glimpses of the old guy and start to feel excited, but feel so sad and disconnected when he quickly disappears. I often feel like I'm grieving my husband who is still alive. Any tips to help the man I love and our children navigate a life of PTSD would be greatly appreciated. Okay, so I have a massive love of first responder spouses. And I think that it is a family commitment. And I will tell you tonight, over on, I'm going to get Des to put the link in the notes tonight. We just created a community called Everyone. And if you haven't seen it yet, I created a course called Hello Hero, and I've put it up there for you to access for free. Because that sounds so kitschy, but it's there. I've created it, and I just really would love the world to have access to it. And I break down some of the specific things that I wish we had in place for spouses. There's a module there for kids, that they can watch. What it means when your dad or your mom or your caregiver does the holy work of first responding, because it is a family commitment. And I would say oftentimes we try to fix the person that we're worried about. They won't go to therapy, or they go to therapy. And oftentimes what we miss is providing that supportive network for the people doing the holding. So I mean, I'm not sure about your particular instance, but I think what is so helpful sometimes is like, where are you putting this? Who do we have in your world that has the ability to sort of hang on to some of these things? And I think that's really critical. Another case, I have another question that I really love here too. My brother completed suicide after a career as a paramedic. I'm looking for how to manage my own PTSD as I navigate my son stepping into this career that killed his uncle, my brother. And I'm also looking for advice on how to help my beautiful boy not succumb to the same demons that took his uncle. Oh, mama. Here's often the issue when, we also have a story. Our body keeps the score about what it means to be a hockey player, a paramedic, a whatever the deal is. And I would say what is so critically important in this process is that we understand so much more today than we did even 10 years ago about what happens in this place of, the integration of experiences and trauma. I think having, being in a place where you are much more educated than, say, the last generation was, being connected to the organizations in which they step into, creating spaces where, your knowledge assists in navigating still, often a very entrenched system, I think becomes important. And I also think that it is so beneficial when we're going to step into these things, or to be supportive, playing supportive roles in the lives of the people we love, which we always, all of us do, is where are we putting it? And I think that it is equally as important. We often identify the person in the midst of it, but I think equally as important is how we're supporting the family system. So, getting talking through this with somebody that you trust and that can therapeutically process some of this stuff for you, I think would be immensely, immensely helpful, especially as your babe steps into it. Okay, I'm going to look a little bit at this question here real quick. Go. Okay, so this is a great question. We have a kid who has an extremely low receptive and expressive language. Okay, so their ability to process language is compromised, and they often flip their lid during times when it's loud. So they get aggressive and will repeatedly yell when they're fixated and cannot even negotiate when you offer them what they want. She continues to scream. Okay, so I think it might be a trauma response mixed with other things, as we know. She's had a tough life. Okay. Yeah. So here is a quintessential question around regulating the body system. Okay. If this babe has enough going on in their world, hypothetically, that they can't navigate the big world around them, it is the job of big people or those who surround them to be able to do that or modulate or regulate that for them. And so I would say it's like little things about, this is such a great time to consult an occupational therapist. This is such a great time to consult a speech language pathologist, and as a team together navigate what is tolerable in this tiny human's body. If there's also the understanding that there may be a trauma history there, having those professionals, and if you don't have access to them, then the idea is this kid is clearly demonstrating that it's too much. And so, because it is an inability to sort of navigate internally what's happening, we do a very good job. We have to do a very good job of assisting in being that regulator. So, shorter exposure times, lots of prep, lots of ability to stay connected during those experiences of getting stimulation into the body, right? Particularly if they can't regulate it a whole lot. We often try to fit kids into the expectations of the world. And when they are not neurotypical for whatever reason, um, we have to do a much better job of attending to that, because exposure will not just get them better. They won't just adapt to it. And I would say in this brief little, snippet that this kid is really, really struggling with the expectations that are there, and because she's just not able to navigate it. So what do we do as big people to assist in making that so much more comfortable? And then she will thrive much more than if we continue to push into places where her system cannot navigate. Okay, how can I stop being so angry? That is such a great question. Now, part of the answer in that process is, how do we get back to the best parts of you? How do we get back to what is making this chippiness so available? Now, here's what happens often when we turn assholery-ish or angry. Our shoulders are up, we have not slept very much, and we have the story in our head that everybody is out to get us. Okay? We lose our ability to have access to empathy and kindness and understanding when we don't focus here first, right? Now, let me be very clear that this has nothing to do with blame. This isn't your, I'm not saying this is your fault. I'm not saying any of those things. This is where we get so messed up in this process. Our biggest focus is not about talking, about all the things you need to do to be a better human. It's really about, again, Bruce Perry stuff. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And when we start to ask that question, the anger has somewhere to go. Okay. Uh, okay. In your opinion, is EMDR, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or accelerated resolution therapy better for PTSD? Great question. I think doing some research in terms of what would fit for you best in that place is really, sometimes we don't have an opportunity to sort of try some of these things on for size, but I really want you to do your research around that and really understand what feels best or fits best for you. I am not super familiar with accelerated resolution therapy. I don't know if you can accelerate much in this place, but again, I think doing some research in that way becomes really, really critical in this place. Will the trauma triggers continue indefinitely, and will the hypervigilance always be so acute? It's so difficult to answer that question just based on a story, but here's what I know. When we remind the body that it doesn't have to be so hypervigilant, when it starts to believe that isn't true, those symptoms dissipate radically. Love this question. How do you recognize PTSD in yourself? Okay, before I read the rest of the question, I'm going to answer this. It sometimes is very difficult to do this in yourself. Okay, so we often ask, I see another question here about, can you self-assess? Can you do those things? I mean, there's all kinds of internet interventions that say, do you got the PTSD? Take this, take that. I would say your best investment is to find either your physician or a trained mental health professional who has an experience in trauma to start to ask those questions. And so next in this line of questioning is, how does it differ compared to everyday stress? Stress is an absolute normal part. Our ability to flip our lids when things get in our way is protective in our body system. The biggest issue is what we do with it that matters. And if there has been a historically a lack of a place to put it historically, then oftentimes that's where it becomes a little bit more debilitating, is a pretty strong word, in your world. So how can you heal from yourself from the inside out? Got to name it to tame it. And why do I feel like some days I'm right back where I started? Okay, good one. So people will say this to me all the time, and this is maybe like not going to be like the hopeful section where they're like, oh my God, will I ever get over it? Oh my God, will this ever go away? How come I have good days and bad days? I mean, this really reminds me of grief in so many ways, right? Because grief and trauma often go hand in hand. Grief doesn't always involve trauma, but trauma usually always involves grief. And what happens in the processing of grief or experiences that have happened in our lives, there are some days where our bodies are relaxed and we're well rested and we've fed it well. And there's no things that in that particular day take us back to a place that we haven't addressed or acknowledged. And on other days, we're tired and people are dinks and we hear the song and it takes us out at our knees. What I really want you to hear in this place is that there's this, it's okay. Drop yourself and give yourself permission to understand that your body's doing the best it can, that it really wants to protect you, and that when this data comes in, it's ready to keep you safe. And our job, your therapeutic team's job, tends to be the place of identifying when those things come so that we can get our body back in a place of processing it and knowing when it needs to be reminded that it's safe. Okay. How can I, how do I gain my confidence and power back? Such a great question. I think it is so much about how do we step in, as Vanderkolk talks a lot about befriending in some ways the experiences that our bodies have put there to keep us safe. And I think that that becomes oftentimes when this is a workplace stress, for example, um, being able to do the work inside our own heads becomes so much more. And Judith Herman talks so much about this. Um, we often expect that the vindication will come when the other person hurts. And often there's very little reprieve when we either see the other person hurt or die or pay the price or whatever that looks like, because those experiences still live in our own bodies. Our own bodies are the ones that matter most. Okay, I hope that helps. What? I'm 23-year police officer, PTSD, emotional numbing after 5 years post trauma. I'm still fit for duty. Could you please talk in your workshop about severe exhaustion, isolation, and dissociation being signs and symptoms of PTSD? Yes. Okay. So beautiful. Thank you so much for bringing this up. Could you please talk about severe exhaustion, isolation, and dissociation as being signs and symptoms of PTSD? I did not seek help because I did not identify my signs and symptoms as being PTSD. Most of the literature describes the signs and symptoms of PTSD as being panic attacks, anxiety attacks, sweating, nightmares, where you wake up screaming and being wired and jumpy and on edge all the time, fight or flight. The severe exhaustion, isolation, and dissociation, that is just as consuming. The freeze is not spoken about as much. Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up. So critically important. So as I talked about at the end, I think it was Herman's work. Get this right. That talked so much about either the hypervigilance that steps in or those extreme levels of responsiveness. Either I'm flattened right out, I'm numbed right out, I am exhausted because my body is so busy fighting every single day that I can't even fucking deal, or I'm jumpy as shit. And I think it's those two extremes of emotion that become so critically important, that therapy or the ability to remind your body that it's safe to come back into that middle phase of what it feels like to live again, is really the point. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I know that's going to be helpful to so many people. What advice would you give teachers who are looking for proactive strategies to support students struggling with PTSD, in particular when behavioral outbursts seem random or sporadic? Love it. Okay. When we are trying, especially from an educational perspective, generally speaking, these kids are not surprises. Generally speaking, when somebody is really struggling with this, if this is an employee, for example, I want you to proactively think about these things. What are we doing to be able to regulate the system at the beginning of the day? Who's getting eye contact? What do we know about this kid? What do they like? What regulates them? What relaxes their body? And I mean that, like, often around things like they love Fortnite. Okay, so we're going to talk about Fortnite most every morning. Taylor Swift is their biggest thing right now. We're going to have some Taylor Swift music in the background. This is a thing that they really like. What is it that regulates the system? And I think one of the biggest mistakes we make with really hypervigilant or over anxious or kids who are in a state of, being hypervigilant because, for example, they watched dad beat the shit out of mom that morning and they're in like this all the time. We just want to treat the anxiety and we forget why it's there. So asking the question, being clear on why it's there is probably, G.K. Chesterton said this: never take a fence down unless you know why it was there. And I really love that quote because oftentimes we want to fix. But I think regardless of the response, it is about how do we regulate the system to the best of the ability and not try to avoid all the triggers, but have a plan for when they're there. We have historically in the world of education and parenting tried to avoid what are the motivators and triggers, because the intention is to keep them motivated to be good and to avoid the triggers that will send them bad. And I think the question needs to be so much more about when we get dysregulated, what is the plan? Because then it feels safe to get dysregulated. And we, as the big people or the caregivers, feel like we are going to be just fine when the big emotion comes. And that is probably 90% of the battle. Okay. Oh my goodness. Listen, there were so many beautiful questions that I didn't quite get to. Thank you so much. So, what I want to direct you to now is certainly you have the recording of this. There is the community that we just launched. I don't know if you've heard about this, called Everyone. There'll be a link in here for you. The Hello Hero course is there for you to take a look at if you'd like. And I Des says make me the host. I forget how I do that. It's coming. Just a minute, Des. I can't in this. The other thing that I wanted to tell you about just before I let you go tonight is, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I hope this was helpful. I hope that there is some help in you seeking your own therapeutic support if that's something that you require. Of course, some of those direction is there in the resource section. And the other thing that I think I want you to know really quickly is that the next workshop is December 5th. Okay. So I think the link is open for that. Just so you know, it's December 5th at 6:30. And you want to hear what it's called? How not to throat punch your relatives over the holidays, managing stress and making memories. That's going to be a gooder. All right. So how not to throat punch your relatives is up next. And then I'm going to have a whole new series planned for next year. So if you've enjoyed these workshops, thank you. Give us any feedback. I think there's a survey that comes out in an email, and I know people really don't think your time is precious, but if you have a few moments to let me know what you'd like to see more of or whether this was helpful or not, I'd really love to know that. And the next one will be in this way. I think in the new year, I'm going to move a lot of these workshops over into the community place too. So stay tuned for that. But this next one, I think the link is open if you want to get some tickets on how to not throw punch your relatives. I think that's going to be a good time. And in the meantime, in between time, take care of each other. We had a heavy conversation tonight. And if you arrived here tonight in this place, no doubt you have experienced something related to big, big emotions in your life or watched other people in your life do that. So I really, before we sign off tonight, I really want you to do everything you can to bring your body back in a state of just grounding. Okay, wiggle your toes, drop your shoulders, take a sip of water if you can, drop your tongue from the roof of your mouth. And thank you so much for being here. See, we were never meant to do any of this alone. And the more scared we become of this world, the less we seek the thing that we need the most, each other. So I'm proud of you for being here tonight. I'm grateful you were here. And I look forward to staying connected and helping any way that I can in all this community spaces. And I hope we can help you get any of the resources that you need. So